Hello and welcome to Media 7. In this program we'll look at the price put on music you use while you're doing something else, talk to a man who wants to make public information really public, farewell a current affairs giant and meet the father of the internet. But first, we'll look at the role in the media of rugby, the national game. Or is it? New Zealanders' interest in rugby is, according to research company UMR, the lowest since surveys began. There's just too damn much of it. It's all about the corporate dollar and we're just not bothered anymore. Or are we? Viewing numbers are suddenly up for the once unglamorous Air New Zealand Cup, and once unglamorous provincial sides are doing better than the big city teams. And only a nation obsessed with rugby could have rung repeated TV reports and 2 front-page leads in the New Zealand Herald from the aftermath of a schoolboy rugby punch-up.
Like, you talk about getting close to the action, you can't get much closer. No.
At the very least, we'll all have to feign interest in rugby come 2011.
Oh, take it on the chin, and you man up. Hey!
So, as the upper level of the game seems forced to devalue itself by laying on even more matches for the media barons and the punters can't even understand the rules anymore, do we talk too much or not enough about our national game? And here's another thing. According to the ratings, more people watched the Netball International on TV1 on Monday than watched the Bledisloe Cup match on pay TV on Saturday. Now, that figure doesn't include the viewing of the rugby replay on Prime, but it does provide food for thought. And joining me now at the table are Sydney Morning Herald rugby writer and founder of theraw.com.au, Spiro Zavos, Sunday Star Times sports writer Richard Bock, and assistant editor and columnist for the New Zealand Herald, John Rowan. Welcome to you all, gentlemen.
Good.
Now, Spiro, what did you make of those figures? A netball invitational outrating a rugby test or appearing to?
Well, women controlling television is the first thing that comes to mind.
You've started well with the audience.
Pay television doesn't have as big an audience, obviously, as free-to-air. And so those figures for pay television are pretty good, actually. I imagine that about half of people with pay television or more were watching the rugby. And apparently those figures also don't take into account replays, videos and all that sort of stuff. But, you know, what it shows is that netball is a terrifically popular sport in New Zealand. And, well, that's great, isn't it?
I looked at the figures for last year. There was a test in July last year against the Springboks that drew 660,000 viewers. That game at the weekend, 432,000. Is that cause for concern?
No, not really. I mean, I think it's a good thing. The obsession, the total obsession with rugby is gone. Like, I'm probably the oldest person here, and when I was at school, you had to play rugby, and a whole generations of New Zealanders were brought up having to play rugby, and a lot of them didn't want to play, but you had to play. It was a sort of just the one game for the whole country. Now, you know, New Zealand's a much more diverse country. There's lots more sports that are popular, more things for people to do on a winter's afternoon, and so that sort of obsession with the game, you know, like I can remember 1956, for instance, you know, that was unhealthy. Now we've got a game which New Zealanders are defined by rugby, which I think is terrific, but we're defined by other things as well.
And you had that UMR survey saying that only 60% of New Zealanders are interested in rugby, the lowest since they started asking that question.
Well, good. You know, I mean, that means that 60% of New Zealanders are interested in rugby, you know, which is a terrifically high number. And, you know, the point about rugby basically is that it's the one thing that really identifies New Zealanders. I also believe that going right back, you know, to 1905, you know, Keith Sinclair said that it was the 1905 All Black Tour which actually created and shaped the New Zealand character, that pragmatic, can-do, take on the rest of the world, confident character. And that has been a very important part of New Zealand life. Now, women are playing rugby as well, so we can expect, you know, that the women will share in that experience, and I just think that's good. But if people want to play other sports, you know, like New Zealand now is winning Olympic medals in triathlon and all this sort of stuff. When we were kids, those events didn't even exist. You know, again, you know, we're a diverse country now. We're not the sort of one sort of Anglo-Celt sort of country. There's people from basically everywhere, and that's reflected in our interests. And one final point, with the netball, that women have played a great part in our social, political, cultural, and sporting life. Again, very good.
Richard Bock, Spiro's clearly untroubled there. There was a perception that the heartland of rugby was suffering, and has been over the past 5 years. And yet we've seen this season, to I think everyone's surprise, a bump in viewership for the Air New Zealand Cup. Well, what's happening there, do you think?
Well, I think the heartland were the last to shift towards professionalism, the last to be seduced by the professional game, really, Russell. And I think that if you look at places like Central Otago, a lot of people there would rather go to a club game and watch their local club game than watch the Highlanders play, because it's still a sense of community. And I think the common factor in what we're seeing is there's been a bit of a novelty factor in the Super 15 and the Super 14 and international rugby being played for a lot of money. But New Zealand sport is all about a sense of community, and I think people still like seeing familiar figures and people that are in their towns and clubs playing sport, and they go along and watch.
So you're setting up this dichotomy between heartland rugby, real New Zealand rugby, and the professional game. Is that how it's falling into place?
No, it also exists in the cities, in urban rugby too. You see people going to club games, to high school rugby is just about the finest rugby you can watch in New Zealand. They play it for the right reason, they play it with a really good attitude, and it's not a lot of the kick and chase that you see in the professional game right now. So I think there were 8,000 at Eden Park the other day for the Mags versus Auckland Grammar final. I think rugby's alive and well in the New Zealand psyche, but maybe we're not lapping up the professional game as much as the TV networks would like us to.
Well, let's stick with schoolboy rugby, John. The punch-up in the semi-final that led to that final, I think, has had more coverage than any schoolboy rugby game in our history. 2 front-page leads in your paper. Why?
Because it was great television, I think. And brawls are always interesting. We always talk about them, we always enjoy them. They're always greeted with great hoots of pleasure whenever they break out. But what's interesting is how we can't discuss things these days, anything, sporting or not. We can't seem to discuss things in reasonable, moderate terms. We get them out of proportion, and this was a classic case where it's easy to blame the media in these things, but it was a discussion point, and we knew it was being discussed from feedback on our website and so on. But the discussion seems to be quite one-sided. It becomes far more serious than it really was.
There seemed to be this compulsion for everyone to have to rush in and express their greatest disapproval.
Yeah.
And why was that? What's going on there? It's hardly the first brawl in the game of rugby. If you go on YouTube, there are plenty of brawls in games of rugby.
Well, I think we're only getting one side of the discussion. It's only people who, for different reasons, want to be appalled or really are appalled who say so, and the majority, I suspect, sit there thinking, gee, I found it quite funny. What's everybody getting worried about?
Is there an element of the game wanting to protect its, the commercial game wanting to protect its image?
Yes, there is, and that's all part of the same syndrome, I think, where the concerned people are the only ones being heard, and so the people defending the sport are worried that they have to face this, and they should be seen to take it very, very seriously and react as they did, and we get the ridiculous punishments put on those kids last week.
Now, going back to the top level of rugby, we're nearing quite an interesting point, Spiro. The Sanzar nations have put their offer to News Limited, which will probably be rejected as an opening bid, and then they'll start negotiating. It seems like the 3 different Sanzar countries are in quite different positions with Rupert Murdoch. For instance, the South Africans have already announced they're splitting off their domestic competition, the Currie Cup. You've got 10 in Australia, a genuine bidder for the rights there. Here it seems like in New Zealand we are stuck with Sky.
Well, I wouldn't say stuck with Sky. I mean, again, I go back to the days when tests were played out of New Zealand, you had to try and listen to the damn thing on radio, and it cut out and things like that. I mean, paid television is bringing us games all around the world into our living room. So that is a terrific thing. I wouldn't say we're stuck with it. We get all the other games. You get the the 5 or 6 nations and all this sort of stuff. So it's just a fact of life. You know, the business model for pay television is basically sport and films. And sport is a terrific thing for them. And like Fox Sport in Australia, for instance, is making huge amounts of money. My guess is that Sky's making a lot of money here.
Sky's making good money here, yes.
And so what is driving that, basically, is the sport. Because Kerry Packer, who knew a lot about television, the one thing that he was adamant on was that live sport is what people will want to watch. And
but on the other hand, you've got the likes of former rugby union PR man Peter Parasini, who's now the head of communications here at TVNZ, making the case that rugby is in a death spiral with its cost structure because it's having to provide so many more games and keep on lengthening the season to meet the needs of the broadcaster that people are tuning out.
Well, he would say that, wouldn't he? I mean, TVNZ used to have a chunk of Sky, and one of the most amazing decisions in the history of television, they sold it. I could never understand that. And now that they've lost the rugby, and you lose the rugby in New Zealand, it's almost like losing to the Wallabies, isn't it? The All Blacks. Look, the more games they have, the more ratings they will get, more people will watch and so on, and the aggregate number of viewers will be greatly increased.
Do you agree with that, Richard? No, I can see you shaking your head.
It's not happening. We're just as interested, but our interest is being spread over a greater number of games, and it's being spread. We can pick and choose. It's like, as Peter Parasini said, it's a huge banquet you go to. There's the salmon and the lobster up the top. Do you take the luncheon sausage around the edge? You don't. You go for the good stuff all the time, and I think that's what we're doing. And he's right. It is a death spiral because to pay for the professional game, and I think they were talking about it costing something like $100 million a year. They have to provide more professional product, and the New Zealand public aren't interested in watching. We'd rather go and watch NPC rugby. And
because there
rugby.
is no prospect of, and what are we talking about, 129 games when the new Super 15 structure comes in? No one can watch all that.
No, but
listen,
can I just put
British soccer must have that many games, and it still holds its audience, still holds its fans.
Critical mass.
Baseball in the US, all sorts of professional sports can do this. It's not the quantity of rugby, it's the quality of rugby, I think, that we're suffering at the moment. Rugby is interesting because it's a chaotic game. The rules are hopeless, and they always will be probably, but it's a constant interesting battle between the players and the rules. And right now the players are winning, and that's actually bad for the game because the players have learned how to just put up defensive screens and stop people actually playing the game. But the rules will catch up at some stage. Somebody will dream up a way to break all these defensive screens, make the game open and interesting and alive.
Well,
again.
we did try with the ELVs, and
yeah.
we had 2 seasons where no one knew what the rules actually were. That was extremely frustrating as a viewer.
10, 15 years ago, everyone had to go and watch the game because it was live. 56, it was packed out. People were being passed down over people's heads on the terraces and stuff, because if you wanted to see it, you had to be there. The other night I watched Manchester United live on TV. I watched the Ashes live on TV in the middle of the night, Black Caps in Sri Lanka, and there was the Sydney Test with the Wallabies. I mean, there is far more product now. It's got nothing to do with how good the game is. It's just that we've got more product.
Can I just make a point?
It's all about how good the game is.
There are 80,000 people at Sydney to watch the Wallabies play the All Blacks, and Wallabies lost their last 3 tests. And the other point is that in the Super Rugby, the teams like all the franchises had to make all their money in 5 or 6 matches. And if they had a rainy day or something like that, their budget was blown. Now they're going to get almost double the number of games, paying the same wages to the players and so on. I just think Peter Parasini's not correct, actually. But, I mean, that's his point of view. The additional games will bring in more revenue for the television companies, more revenue for the unions, and
yet, Spiro, as a punter, I think the first 3 seasons of Super 12, I went to every home game, every Blues home game. I think I went to 2 this year. I mean, John, are you the same?
Well, yeah, that's my point. And it was good in those days. And as recently as 2006, the All Blacks were playing a great, open, expensive game of rugby that I'd have watched them 4 times a weekend if I could. It isn't the quantity. We'd appreciate this many games if the quality was better.
But, I mean, the Lions played wonderful, attractive attacking rugby in South Africa and lost the Test series against the Box, who appear to have cracked the way the...
And Graham Henry's problem is that he could do the same thing this year and lose to the Springboks too, and has.
Richard?
I think I've stated my case. I just think it's a saturation point. You know, you can make as many games as you want or create as many extra games as you want. But I think New Zealanders have got to the point where they're picking and choosing, and you can only spread our interests so thin.
With these professional opportunities, how has it changed the nature of the game for young people playing it? Because now clearly there are young people, including some of those people in the grammar punch-up, who are looking at it as a career. How does that change the game?
The biggest change I've noticed between amateur and professional sport is the lack of respect now in professional sport for the loser. One thing about sport that every contest has to have is a loser, and I remember the West Indies, the first cricket team that ever lost to the New Zealand team in 1956. We created a world record, in fact, in terms of how long we went before we won a test. The guys from that West Indies team said that there was no ignominy, no disgrace, no shame. In fact, they said they had such a good party afterwards at Eden Park that they're quite happy they lost after all.
But is that not in some sense driven by you guys? Because, John, did we always go into a national sulk when the All Blacks lost?
Yeah, we do, don't we?
Has that always been the case, or have we just gotten worse?
We didn't used to lose, did we, Sparrow?
No,
well, that's a myth. That actually is a myth.
I can't remember how many
when the 1905 All Blacks were overseas, how did they get the news back? From the post office used to put all the stuff up, and I read an account of a person in Wellington who was walking to the post office and he knew that the All Blacks had lost. Why? Because there was a flag at half-mast. And the great crowds gathered around the Wellington post office and then got the bad news that the All Blacks had been beaten by Wales and so on. And for a long time, that was how, before broadcasts, radio broadcasts, which happened, I think, in the 1930s, the first one, that was the way the news was. And the headlines always were Black Day and things like that, because as John said, the All Blacks very rarely lost. They didn't lose to Australia for 7 years, the first time they lost to Australia, and of course, you know, in England they've lost about 8, or Europe they've lost about 8 tests since 1905. So
we are actually going to have to go. I'm going to have to blow the final whistle. So thank you to Spiro Zavos, John Rowan and Richard Bock. After the break, music rights fees. Should businesses be afraid?